podcast listeners, if you hear my voice right now, I need you to do something for me. I want you to take out your phone or on your computer, go to Apple Podcasts, search for Ask Your Oldhead podcast. You'll see my logo, my little picture, my little image there. Find the show. Please rate and write a review. It's a small thing, but it helps others find this work and find what I'm doing here. And it really, really matters, as small as that may seem. So if you could please do that before we get into the show, I would much appreciate it. Thank you for listening. Let's get into it. Peace. Peace. I'm Majestic.
Peace, Justice Rajee.
Hey, so we're back together again, and wanted to dive in. Charles Blow, columnist of New York Times, also the author of The Devil You Know, which we discussed earlier this year.
Yeah,
Last year? Yeah.
Late last year. Yeah.
Yeah, but he has a recent column that I thought was interesting about Defund the Police, and just, and I'll read the title. Defund the Police is dead. Now what? And through the piece rather, the focus that he taps on is, and I think this is, been well documented in a part of the discussion. So, we're not gonna, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time going like, well, is it like discussing the idea of the merits of the actual, policy demand, policy ask, policy position, but more the nature of what is happening with it. And the idea that he really lands on or brings into question is, in many respects, the general idea that as like an actionable thing that I know any like national elected or even a state level elected, maybe a state rep could probably run on it in America, but like, basically that it is more or less dead. People, there's been, copious debate about, whether it was wise politically or not. And then this general conversation about like, well, what does it really mean? And what does it mean to this people? What does it mean to those people? But the point he gets to, at least in my eyes, is sort of if this conversation is stopped, right? If this has a positive, like, well, so what is the conversation around, reform, and change as it pertains to police, law enforcement, public accountability as it relates to those two entities, and the reality that conversation and that concept is the current interpretation of an ongoing frustration, to stop, which unfortunately I actually was just scrolling through my I have a one of those search alerts, and there's always a black man or other black person, but definitely a black man. There's still the rate has not dropped of the black man killed in contact with police, whatever the case may be or the circumstances of the engagement. So yeah, I guess I hope that's enough framing. At least get started talking about it. But what were some of your thoughts from the piece that he wrote, and if there's anything that jumped out at you? Let's chop it up a little bit.
Yeah, I think I think Charles Blow's a really good columnist and writer, and we talked, about The Devil You Know, and I think he takes nuanced but forceful positions. That whether you agree with them or not, I think it's a space for thought. I think this one is definitely one where it's unusual. The language was so forceful of defund the police. I think a lot of people got behind it, especially when you watched someone murder someone. Right. So the idea is though we know police violence has been going on against against all people, right? Because sometimes we forget that police will police will beat up a white person too. But police violence against all people, but
Mm-hmm.
specifically like black people and black men, kind of the most acute, has been going on for some time, but I think the ability to watch someone's neck, someone be held down for almost 10 minutes, um, lended itself to the force of that statement. And with the space where everyone was in around COVID, plus that, I mean, it was a really powerful space for that time. It wasn't, it was not the thing that SNCC or the SCLC or the NAACP did in the civil rights movement, where everybody sat and debated the, kind of wording and how we're going to show up to the event, right? So it's way different than that kind of thing as far as a movement and being thoughtful around how that happens. But for that time in that space, it was very powerful and, was a response to the time. And I think he touches on a good point to saying, okay, if you don't like the statement, and that's one thing, do you understand the power of what it means for resources to be diverted if we assume, or if the data tells us one thing, but I'll share my thought on that in a minute. The data tells us that the increasing amount of police per se does not reduce a thing, but I do think that's something in the minds and in the thoughts of people that it does, right? And so the challenge on telling people, well, if you invest money in after school programs, you're going to stop crime or you'll reduce crime, right? Like that's a leap that I think for some people is difficult to take. And I think that's the kind of challenge of where we are now in the implementation strategy of idea of redirecting resources is how do you do that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And and this is just, speaking from my experience in prevention and intervention work, my experience as growing up black in America my whole life, uh,
Oh,
my whole life, whole time. I like to make sure everybody knows that whole time I was here. You know what I'm saying? The I think at times this discussion becomes almost like talking about like a mythological creature of some sort, because I think the size of it is like it gets sacrificed to what seems like a simple or quick answer or direct line. So what I'm saying is like you go, all right, we can improve and make our our communities safer and more livable if we have long-term strategic investment in the primary basic needs of the people in those communities, and in equitable processes to maintain and sustain those spaces, right? Which is like, oh yeah, everybody, like, if you're like a policy person, you're like, yeah, that's true. If you're an average person, you're like, what does that actually mean? Does that
right.
mean, like, what does that mean, right? And so then even if you when you get into the like the nuts and bolts of a different way of responding to public safety concerns, and the like broader idea of like making, because we're really talking about is safe, sustainable, real well running communities. And when you have to put that in the light of a society, and not just the United States, but our modern world, that at its core, to produce the energy, if we say that our modern world is a result of the sort of the industrial revolution on an international scale, you have a modern world that required the constant subjugation of other humans to develop the kind of the energy and the space to create the systems that like kind of still run and dictate uh how we, these idea like, oh, we can like build stuff over here and then you ship it to these people over there and then they buy it and there's trade and the people invest in things. Like we have this whole world that is constructed on an input that at some point said that there were some people whose lives didn't matter and they could be
Right.
fodder for the machine to work. Boom, boom, boom. You fast forward, then you go, yes, the in order to secure the safety of places where people live, you had a mix of yeah, we need some sort of entity that can be called and helped, or when something goes wrong. And then, but at the same time, you also had like long running tradition of sort of like maybe more we'll call them informal institutions that provided safety.
Right.
In the maybe some more formally informal than others, in terms of what we might call street organizations or neighborhood associations or groups, sometimes dominated by a certain ethnic or religious backgrounds, that were cultural and specific. Not always fair, not always equitable, but they may have formed an order, right? So it's like, and I'm going, I know some people are like, where is justice going? I'm saying that we have an very abstract idea of how do you actually have order? Like most of us have experienced, if you live somewhere, usually the places where one may actually be safest, meaning the incidents that you may be the victim. And I think when people think of safety, they think of like violent crime. They may also be thinking of like, people stealing your carburetor, or stealing your catalytic converter, which I just, for the record, there was a big bust here. And the community where the folks were found to have been running at least one operation that was stealing catalytic converters and selling them up and down the West Coast was operating, or at least operating in full or in part, out of Lake Oswego, Oregon. Lake Oswego is one of the wealthiest communities, if not the wealthiest, in the state of Oregon. And just for the record, I don't know everybody. Let's think about that. We'll come back to it later when we talk about public safety. That one of the wealthiest communities in the state was found to be harboring at least 3 locations that were operating and moving catalytic converters that have been stolen from all over the region. I'm just going to lay it out there, and I'm not going to give any judgments at this time. So when we start talking about how does one be safe, most of the time, if you live in a neighborhood or a space, even if it's a block where most everybody has more or less what they need to be in their space, it's relatively safe. You know what I'm saying? Like you may not have the open air drug markets of the 80s and 90s, and then the residual realities that happen with those spaces, right? That, I think, that's the nightmare kind of American like vision, is this like folks imbibing substances, and then the things that some will happen when people are in that level of distress. The other aspect that I think people frame as a lack of safety are sort of this, generally just the idea that someone who I don't think I can account for how they're going to behave, and or I believe whatever narrative has been developed about those people. So when they show up in the space that I normally in, I feel unsafe now, i.e., Black person walking through a neighborhood that's not predominantly Black, or other communities, moving through a space where people don't expect to see you. Like we get into this real murky, spacey place, right? So then when you land on police become a very like, well, I know what that is, and they have on uniforms, and they say they have a code and they got rules. So it's very easy to assign that wherever that entity shows up, it instantly makes a space safer, right? If you're, again, not us who have experienced the other side of that experience, and that the reality of every step of when you study it, of whether it's protests, from union organizing back to the 1800s, late 1800s into the early 1900s, as police were first forming, to definitely any focused study on the American Civil Rights Movement and related movements to try to make the United States live up to its creed. Police often are landing on the wrong side of the historical page as it pertains to protecting the rights of regular folks. That's a reality of systems change that I would hope those in law enforcement, and I think I know, at least I know some professionals in that world who embrace that idea and acknowledge like, yo, we have a culpability here. Um, so when we get into discussion about the fund, the police, you have a high level of frustration that led, like, instead of analyzing why would people, how can people be so frustrated with something that is in our system that they like, look, just cut the budget. We don't even want to talk about changes. Let's just cut the budget, right? So instead of exploring that, instead of finding a way to embrace that, we landed in this, the ongoing American struggle of like being at this is my analogy, my metaphor for, this conceptual sort of dining room table where these folks that are all related, and the one family member comes again and you want to get rid of all the police. And you're like, well, I mean, I'm saying I don't want to get rid of all the police. I'm just saying we should think about it. And then these other folks are going, but, kind of gas, custom the pearls around the idea that, you know, some rogue band of uh, bandits of just waiting, like waiting on the other side of a hill for the police to leave to run over and take everybody's stuff. Right. Like none of that is actually how crime happens in America, but that is the framing. All right. So that I'd say that then, and especially speaking to, I guess folks who would put themselves firmly in the conversation about systems change. What are we going to do to really create the simultaneous policy conversation about the investments that are needed to make the spaces that our communities primarily inhabit and others safer, more equitable, and get what they need, and also, have the appropriate tools and focuses to engage, the acute, gun violence issues, which you know disproportionately impact Black men. Right. So I spend a lot of time on that because of all the issues in America that definitely, without question, need to be rooted in what Black men experience. Gun violence as it pertains to local, human spaces is an issue that we it's us. We the ones that most often, you know, which gun violence is actually interpersonal violence, but guns being the implement of that interpersonal experience outcome most of the time. This is not necessarily a conversation about mass shooters, right? Which is a different conversation about gun violence, which sometimes though all gets thrown in the same pool, but the methodologies to impact those are different. So it's like if folks have by and large said we're going to just leave, we're going to drop the ball, we're going to leave the defund conversation alone, we're going to move on to other topics, but the primary discussion then doesn't involve any discussion about prevention and intervention strategies, the difference between acute intervention work and long-term systems change to not require, like, mean that you have communities that don't no longer have the experience that you need that innate contact, and then the total difference in what these other areas of violence prevention, not to mention, that domestic violence still being a primary driver, and one of the higher for most places. If there's something that's going to bring a lack of, like an acute safety risk to your neighborhood, it is domestic violence happening on your street with one of the families on your street where you live. Like in this county, I'm not going to throw it off the top, but there's been several of the shootings that have happened were all domestic violence related. Right. So when that number gets thrown out of, oh, there was this many shootings and this many deaths, that's usually not pulled out. Right. And that's not domestic violence. That's just domestic violence. That's not domestic violence by like race or, certain class or circumstances. It's just the reality of what domestic violence looks like in America. So it's like we have this question, and I think the column asks it like, all right, if to everybody, if on the national kind of progressive to liberal arc of public safety and systems change discussion is going to not center on a conversation around defunding the police, and with that, what that means a divestment from police and an investment in these other areas. We gonna have a conversation about investment in structures or not? Because we could put that over here, but how are we gonna have this other conversation? So,
well, I think I think there's a couple things that, again, looking at this focus of, May 2020, May 2020, what's happening, the previous president, doing what he's doing. Let's just call it that. You had this like acute focus on when everyone could sit and watch a show. To me, this is my vantage point. When everyone could sit and have the attention on specific sets of issues, everyone has to come to grips with the fact of I watched this happen for 10 minutes. It's not an accident. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a gun discharge. It wasn't a scuffle, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was a murder, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think wisely people said, hey, this is a murder. This is why this needs to happen. I think a couple of things happened after that. I think Joe Biden becoming president, in some senses, took some of the pressure out of that. And I think a lot of activists were trying to make sure it didn't come out of that, but almost like, where Joe Biden stands on police, right? Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, you can't not have him there because of the other person that's there, right?
Right.
So politically, you have to make the decision of like, okay, do I take the guy who's telling you, hey, I'm with you 84%, but I'm not with you on this one,
Yeah.
right? Like, yeah, I'm not with you. And you have to eat that one, quote unquote, right? And then as we come out of the pandemic, I think one thing you talked about, Justin, was a really good point, was there are conditions that either people don't have what they need or they're traumatic conditions that produce other behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you look at like a lot of our communities, Black, brown, communities, you see some long-term traumatic challenges that are producing certain behaviors. The pandemic itself was a acute thing that I think has produced some unintended consequences other than the obvious death of millions of people. But it also created there were some infusions of capital into the economy. There were people who could not work. There was a whole host of stuff that I think then created, once the world started to open up, a unique set of challenges that kind of reset our clock.
Mm-hmm.
The challenges that we saw with or that we are seeing in certain cities and certain areas are resetting the clock as far as people's perspective, because then it went from I had to be in the house to watch this, and no matter how I am, no matter how I see the world, I had to acknowledge I saw a man murdered on television.
Mm-hmm.
To, hey, when are you going to send my kid back to school? Hey, do I have to get a shot? Right? So it becomes now these other things that become much more personal to people, unfortunately. Then the systems change in the conversation, and then the resulting kind of interpersonal violence and the level again of this like infusion of cash into communities and some unintended consequences. For those who know what I'm saying, I'll just leave it. I'll leave it there.
Mm-hmm.
That then started to create some conditions that were not happening pre-COVID. Right? There was some stuff you just weren't seeing pre-COVID that you see in communities now. And we're going to have to do a long-term reckoning with this. This is something that the New York Times is going to do an article, I'm sure 5-6 years from now, and talk about, frankly, the emotional and cultural wreckage that came from COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And I think interpersonal violence and what you start to see more now with, I'll just say it straight out. I think we got more comfortable with the idea. We got reacquainted. Some people got reacquainted with the idea of the smash and grab.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a thing that was not it was not part of the arsenal of maybe a generation of folks a little younger, of like, hey, how am I gonna get paid? Right? Like that was a thing that came when I was a kid and everybody was scared to go downtown for Easter, because it was happening.
Right.
Because
It could be you, as they say.
it could be you. The smashing grab, like it could happen to you. And but I think it's like almost like 30 years or something that people was kind of like, no, that's not a way I'm going to actually do certain things. That's not a way I'm going to participate in the underground economy. And I think post what's the name again with some of the energy and anger, it became a part of this conversation. So we're just seeing all this kind of stuff, and I think from a policy perspective, it just moved it, because now we left systems change and went back to individual experience. We went back to how does someone feel when they're in downtown Pittsburgh or downtown Portland or New York? Like, how do you feel? Right? It went from, so I think there's a I have argued and have said on here before, I think the progressive community, the center left has always struggled from ways to touch people other than like guilt.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think guilt is the main tool of the persuasive process for the center
Mm-hmm.
left.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think I this is my I don't think guilt is a long term strategy for change. I think we've seen it over and over again. The things that have changed, it was guilt, and then it went into to your point about the systems of making people well, right? Like there's a difference between like I'm mad at you, like this is wrong versus here's what I'm doing to make it right. And I think it suffers from that and the internal push of the frankly Democratic Party. And the last thing I'll say here, a somewhat openness from some elements of the conservative or the Republican Party to acknowledge the move just far enough not to piss off their constituents.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So they knew how to get a bill passed to move just far enough to say that nothing changed. Now, there's not the substantive change that many people were looking for, right? So I think it's one of those, again, goes back to these like political and structural realities of like an idea that is so important whose time has come has been kind of thrown into the political pinball machine
Mm-hmm.
and just batted around. And the last thing I'll say about this is, and we've talked about this before, the idea of like, here's state, even if state sponsored violence, I'm be careful with that. State accepted violence,
Mm-hmm.
state accepted murder. And the answer to dealing with that was give black people mortgages, give black people jobs.
Right.
So all the money that came out was from banks and things about industries and their, the movies now going to have more black folks on the thing. Google's going to give you more tablets. And so it got away from like answering the question about state accepted violence to like something that everyone was more comfortable with was giving money to create more diversity in an industry, which on a one-to-one level is not going to produce the outcomes because how society will reallocate itself. Okay, you gave them some jobs. I don't know if they're gonna live in a black neighborhood. Let's be honest.
Mm-hmm.
In the way America is structured, if you're giving people a whole bunch of opportunities outside of a couple upper middle class places in America, rich black people or really well-to-do black people live with other well-to-do people
Yeah.
who tend to be white.
Yeah.
So the answer to of like, yo, let me give more people these like big opportunities is necessary but insufficient to even touch the idea of state accepted violence. Or we have to have an internal conversation. We got to have a closed door conversation about this. How is it actually going to affect the black community when you give people opportunities, but that it doesn't create a cycle? So,
Mm-hmm. Man, that's peace. I think you tapped. The only thing I'll add, just to put a pause, on this particular discussion is, I think the questions that the column, and I encourage anyone, please read the column, and feel free to shoot a message if you feel so inclined around your thoughts of what the column is stating and just this issue, and this policy discussion or whatever have you. Is though like we still have not had a substantive um conversation about like safety. About like we talk around the topic, but we don't talk about the topic. We talk around the issue of the conditions that supposed that these two things parallel around, or the reasoning for their existence, but we do not we behave as if, and I'm saying the collective we, everybody that's part of the country, I mean, me and myself too. I mean, I point finger at justice is part of maybe trying to have that conversation, but the planning, the details around what folks what really goes into the world that we live in, inhabit, and are continuing to build, in the direction that it goes, and sometimes we talk about it as if we are not actors in it. And as long as we continue to do that, we will, what you defer to others to make decisions about, others will make the decisions. And yeah. So I'm fully open to let's talk about how we develop, what we do and where we're going. I don't know that everyone is actually on board with that, and for some, I'm sure it's probably quite a scary proposition. I mean, I'll share maybe at a future dialogue an article that I started reading, which I'm going to get the longer version of the article, just about the frankly dystopian view that some people with lots of resources have about our future as a society. And I think this conversation is a part of that conversation, which we're going to have at a later date. So with that, we could just pass check ball to a new topic.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So the other thing that since last time we recorded really came up, and I thought we wanted to touch base with you on, was student loan forgiveness. And everyone was anticipating since the election, I guess, right? Am I fair in saying that, like, what the Biden administration's plan would be, and all of the requisite arguments of whether or not the federal government can just decide student loans are forgiven or not. Which I'm going to say this, and I'll ask any constitutional scholars out there or U.S. history scholars. More or less, American society has shown you could do kind of whatever you want if everyone doesn't make a big stink about it. Which is one exhibited by the pernicious experience of Black folks under since Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement and post, meaning that there was quite often a part of American society that you could just brutalize Black people and more or less not face any consequences. So that's out there. That's on the record. It's not really a controversial statement. Maybe some folks feel it is, but it's not. Look it up. And we could go into other, that I know that being a very somber note. Sorry, everyone. But I'm trying my best. I'll be trying to stay positive, man. But it's, it's hard to talk about our experience and not bring up the sad stuff, man.
He said, "Let me take you to a deep dark place."
Deep dark place. You know what I'm saying? The sound a very serious episode of the Good Brothers. You know what I'm saying? On a special episode, Justice is going to bring everybody down again.
No, but I will say real quick, I think that's but here's a point of, like, it's history. It's regrettable that it's happened, but it's important to note that it was a norm.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes the bad thing about not talking about history or trying to talk about it again using the grief methodology is like, no, it's part of history. It happened. Part of it is we don't teach actually American history in schools, so no one knows it actually happened. Right? Like, no one knows that actually is the case. But no, it happened. It's on the record. Let's talk about it, and let's actually just start from there versus starting from the grief about the fact that it existed.
Right. And just to spread the wealth of mayhem and misfortune, it's the use of whatever the operational administrative vehicle has authority to get other ends, i.e., I was reading something about, like, Salem witch trials and how at basically they may have started on some, whether you think this is a good or not, concern about witchcraft in the community, right? But you gotta understand that the religious aspect of the society that they were trying to craft required, orthodoxy and everybody being on board, and so there you couldn't have people being witches and also build, like a puritanical state. Then the other thing was that once it started rolling, it became a vehicle. If you wanted that person's land, be like, oh, there are witches over there. Check them out. And then what happens? That land is now available, right? Like, this ain't the first, and so when you look at the history of the idea of using whatever the administrative power to be twisted or contorted to other means for folks who, as I'm this is Justice's opinion, didn't have the moral intestinal fortitude to do the right thing and treat people right and be fair, is not is not circumscribed just to Black folks. You know what I'm saying? But we pick a lion's share. We hold a lion's share of it within the American dialogue. So student loans. So what that gets to though is so everyone was waiting. And the plan that they released, and I think I for myself, and I'm going to say I don't know if I've said it on this. I recently, after 10 years of public service work, which I had took intentionally. Well, one, because I like working with my people and in the community and service, but two, under the understanding that after 120 payments, I would be able to get the remaining balance forgiven. Finally, actually got the remainder of my student loans forgiven. But the reason that I was able to do that was because when the Biden administration started, they did begin the temporary reassessment because the analysis that showed that basically no one was getting the public service, the various different public service. And there's all kinds of loan forgiveness programs out there that are not just public services. One around medical, going into medical fields. I think there's ones, there's special programs for a lot of stuff that some of us may not know about. But the capacity for me to get considered because of some technicalities basically required that temporary kind of adjustment that basically everyone, if you've been paying your balance, would have the opportunity to apply, and if you had the requisite employment, get your loans forgiven. And I was a beneficiary of one of those. Save the collective Rajee experience, $29,000 of remaining debt. And for that, Big Joe, you know what I'm saying? One love from Team Rajee. You know what I'm saying? Way to come through and do what you said. Now, fast forward to the broader reality that goes beyond my experience is, was it 10,000 off if you up to 20,000, or is it 20,000 or more, or 20,000 if you received a Pell Grant?
Pell Grant, yeah, if you had a Pell Grant.
And obviously, folks wanted whatever you had forgiven, right? They wanted, however big it was, which I ain't necessarily, I'm not here to judge if that is, good or bad. Or but that was the desire. So some people were dissatisfied. Others were like, hey, it is, I mean, it's for a lot of people, that could be a significant cut in what they owe, right? I guess my question to you, just so I stop being the one talking, what was your first thoughts just when you saw like kind of some of the plan was, or like what was your, I don't know if we've talked about it in detail. What was your first thoughts, or what is your thought around like just this approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, so my first thought about it is, and I think this is just brass tacks politics, the Democratic Party needed to have something that related as a real pull to young white people. Mm-hmm. I think you needed something to get them out. And there was nothing on the table other than Trump being Trump that would have actually gotten them out. And I think a lot of the, think tanks and people who have been thinking about this kind of stuff for a long time were ready to pounce and say, hey, here's a thing that if we do, we can get out a disillusioned group of middle class or come from middle class communities, white kids. Mm-hmm. Now, I think the conversation around getting rid of debt for Black folks is a different conversation. Mm-hmm. I think the conversation around the way of like some people feeling like they took a lot of loans for jobs that just are not there. Mm-hmm. And this is one way that you could directly speak to their needs, because they don't have needs. And I'm speaking generally here. A middle class white kid is holding a whole bunch of debt, doesn't have a whole bunch of other interventions in our economy. Mm-hmm. Like there's not a whole bunch of other stuff you could do to give them something very particular. You could say you could work with the Dreamers. You could talk about HBCUs. You could talk about building more affordable housing. You could talk about increasing American worker protection, like all the different groups that the Biden campaign needed to cobble together. There were obvious things in all of those. but I think there was a missing population. So I think that's where at the end of the day it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Joe Biden, President Biden is who he is. This is like I talked about on the other side. He is who he is, right?
Right.
So he wasn't trying to give all y'all let all y'all off the hook. Now it's important to remember that my student loans have been taken via my salary at a variety of times. So I'm one of the few people in the world that already took my money.
Word up. Man.
They took them through a couple different times of some tax returns. But but like, so I think that that's the reality of like, okay, here's how you get to a place if you're saying you're going to do it. 10,000 would never have been enough
Yeah.
because the debt that people are holding with the assumptions of what it would do for you in American society is way bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that the vantage point of doing it, making the Pell Grants get more, was a racial equity lens on the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it was done very well because it's acknowledging the nature of it. You were coming from a certain position and holding more debt generally.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think from a policy perspective, it was actually well done. Again, you would never make everybody happy, but along with the other wins that the Biden administration has been getting, I think it was a good addition. I do wonder if they hadn't got some of the other stuff done, would it have been that number? Like, I'm inclined to think it would have been a bigger number. But
Yeah.
when you get the IRA, you get all these bills, right? You get the CHIPS Act, you're getting all this stuff. The student loan one doesn't have to be the big kahuna, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think, it was an important strategy to get there. It was an important strategy of promises, promises made, promises kept. And I also think that student loans, very much like the other conversation we're having, it's all about this idea of systems that we are now coming to understand again are broken because the systems of how much loans that you could take out and where you could go was based on, in my estimation, I think historically, it's not just my perspective. If you take out this amount of stuff, you will go and make this much money and you'll be able to pay them people back.
Right. Right.
So you're taking this as a loan out on your success in our society. And I think for years we accepted that you're taking this loan as a success because if you go to college and if you go to grad school and if you do these things, you will make enough to make it make sense. And then the banks and these people will get their money too, right? Part of the American economic system. When that has broken down, that promise that you would make this amount of money is no longer there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The promise that the job you had to do a set of things may be sent to someone else. Organizations have gotten better technologically. They don't need as many people
Mm-hmm.
to do what you may have done definitely 30 and even 20 years ago. So the system to me, what, as we're talking about this systems change and systems breakdown, the conversation is going to have to be had now, whatever people got to 10,000 or maybe more of what is the role of colleges and the cost of college,
Mm-hmm.
the cost of these loans versus what's out here for you to succeed professionally. And I think we got to have a massive reconstruction of that conversation.
Yeah. 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 Well, and I think it bears, the or pushes or asks that we look at, like, one, knowing the history of even the current structure that we have, and there's good articles out there and books about this, back to uh oddly enough, starting in California, which at one time and still has pretty robust, at one time had the most robust kind of investment in education in the country, where generally almost anyone, for a time, if you could get through high school, you could go and get a really cheap degree, in whether that be a liberal arts field to a science field, whatever, you could do it. And and the idea that a contingent of our society, I guess, the late 60s, 70s, conservative movement felt that it was too nice a benefit and people weren't grateful. I mean, that's that ain't just Justice's words. That's from multiple sources that have talked about that time frame and the idea of we're going to basically make this put more risk on you as the student that then may circumscribe your wish to kind of agitate, whether the reality of, which often goes to the American fascination with, well, I guess probably not just American, it's probably a worldwide thing of like people are dissatisfied with the structure of society, and then I pick some part of society to decide that that's the part of society that's why they're actually upset, not because this is an unfair system, right? So like, at some point in a European village, there was a serf, and the serf was like, "Yo, this is fucked up. I can't leave." And then the person goes, "Oh man, them serfs, if they just didn't know there was people on the other side of that hill, they wouldn't be dissatisfied." It's like, no, the system is not fair, dog. Like, it has nothing to do with the people on the other side of the hill. This is unfair. You basically own me. I can't leave. Right. And then, except then when, industrialization changed and suddenly you didn't need all those serfs and peasants hanging out in the valley no more. So you're like, hey, we got this thing happening. It's called colonization. You want to go over to another country and like see if you can start a future there? Right. Like this is the cascading reality that we exist in here. And again, that's not just circumscribed but we live in America, which is, anyway, connected to Europe and colonization, So just in case anybody missed those connections. Then so you get to this age, by the time we're in starting college in the 90s, we're probably I think the 90s is sort of the break point between like where you still did have like pretty decent state investment in most schools, but schools were moving to the like, oh, we could just load these people up. These people could load up with loans and afford this. So whatever is we're not getting in terms of state level investment, and particularly speaking to land grant institutions and publicly funded institutions, we can offset that to the students taking out more loans. Moving to this age now where there's the offset to students taking more loans and then also charging an exorbitant rate for international students to subsidize. I mean, it's quite, it starts sounding like a real, when you start looking and you read some different things about the financing of how so much stuff is paid for by like charging somebody that can pay a lot more as opposed,
absolutely.
And then again, kind of referencing the previous conversation, not having a larger conversation like, why are we doing this? Like, what are people coming to these places to learn? Like there's people that decry sort of the direct connection of the idea that college is this workplace development space when it should not be in totality, although you can't escape that there are certain things in the professions that we quite need, like, well, I mean, I could run them down, but medical engineers, scientists, even though some of these may be able to be done in different structures, right, than the way that the modern college experience works. But we do need people to learn certain skills and trades. And then we do also need space where people are just developing their intellectual capacity to respond to our changing reality.
Right. And get the tools. Yeah, like we have to get away from this idea like you shouldn't go to college to learn how to be smarter. Like, yes, there's stuff on the internet. Yes. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that every kid is not self-directed. If we follow that logic, just give a kid a computer.
Right.
And he'll just learn it.
They'll just find all of it.
Yeah, just find all the good stuff. And then end up smart. Find all the good stuff. Let him watch Bill Nye the Science Guy and everything will be okay. Like, no, there's a process of what people know how to do and are skilled with imparting information. And there is an important part of thinking about the world. And this is from a person who does choose to learn a whole bunch of stuff, by myself, and obviously how our learning system goes. Like, but at the same time, that doesn't mean you shouldn't go and take a class to learn about history.
Yeah.
Because someone got paid to tell you some shit you couldn't find out.
Yeah. I mean,
so we shouldn't do that.
Yeah, and the thing I would propose to those who don't, or like, well, I mean, you could just Google it. I'd be like, listen, I go on Twitter and search up syllabi, because different sometimes, and I've seen this, and I bookmark them sometimes, where folks are teaching a class and they're like, hey, here's my syllabus for this year. And one of the, especially when you if you have the good fortune to work with a really good academic that's really into setting a foundation for you to learn about whatever their area of expertise, when you see the depth of sources sometimes that are in, what you have the opportunity to study, if you had to do all that legwork to get all those sources so then you could start reading, to start working on learning about the thing, you, we all can't get there. It's a waste. It's a totally inefficient way to think about learning, to go like, no, there shouldn't be, we shouldn't try to pull from people who had to like share our collective sort of like, yeah, I went real deep on this. Now I'm gonna share it with other people and go, no, you go deep on your own and find it. It's like, nah, man, if you already went deep, man, share that. So I can, because my interest might be over here, you know what I mean? And then also the general reality, like, and this is my, and I'm at some point I'm going to do a Rajee deep dive or deep rant on the way people think about IQ, especially certain people. I ain't gonna call them out, but there's certain people when you go on the internets who will go like, "Yeah, you probably don't even have a high IQ." And what they're trying to say is, they're still believing in the fully made up construction that some people are just smarter based on their race, which was, going back to Linnaeus, which was totally made up. Linnaeus just made it up. He didn't, like a lot of things humans do. He made it up, but like he made it up.
You are on fire today. You are a doozy today, Jack.
Yeah, man. I'm red hot, man. They've been, people out here, as they about to come off my stoop, as they say. About to get off the stoop, right? Like, we have these things and folks will just throw it out there, but for them it's their vehicle to go, I don't need to listen to you, because but the reality is, like, there's a value to creating the centers to not to want to study, to hold what has been learned, to create the infrastructure to make sure things that have been learned can be shared. And there's also the constant experience, and I remind people of this, that sometimes people, despite folks, as I had to say to a family member, well, one, I guess there's a whole lot of problems with Elon Musk, but I'll just say this: people assign him this great intellect and ability, but somehow he still started a factory that doesn't treat people of color well. Despite everything we know about management, institutional design, all the information that's out there to make it an equitable and fair space, you still have somebody that, you have Black and brown folks experiencing things in their in the manufacturing facility right now, right? And that has a pending lawsuit, civil lawsuit, I believe is still underway, making Teslas, which is supposed to be this modern futuristic car, but you still couldn't develop the internal structure to have a fair and equitable experience for the people who work there. How come your intellect can't fix racism? Right? We had very smart people who would then go, yeah, and those blacks, not so great, right? Like, it's a bad equation, right? So there's that. And then another part, just again staying in, I'm just going off on the edge. Uh, the loan forgiveness and a part of the deal was the idea that you're going to take on sort of learn this specialized world so that you could do specialized roles within our society that you might not be able to do if you didn't do this certain type of coursework or go to this type of study or get this particular type of training. And the other side of that then becoming this sort of thing, and I as I used to call it to my kids, the academic American academic warfare, where you have to decide, like, are you going to be a person that's going to, go to a private, expensive, hard to get into school, which then is supposed to assign a certain level of merit to you to be worthy of high paying roles inside of, the Fortune 500 entities, the large, nonprofits, think tanks, specialist worlds, are supposed to influence the direction of our society. And there's definitely an overpromise in terms of like, oh, you just get a degree, man, and the world is your oyster. And it's like, no, it ain't. Right? Like, and some people, fully aware of that. But there's other things like if you want to be a teacher, you need to go to a teacher college. Like you need to go through a teacher learning experience. Yes, you can learn certain things about teaching just by being working in schools and being like, well, we just got to connect with the kids as people, right? But there is structural stuff that is good for you to sit and contemplate so that you don't, when you hit those hard parts of being a teacher, you're not trying to start from zero, that you can actually grow from the wisdom of others. You can have the balance between, experienced long-term teachers, folks who've sat and done studies. Like there's all these different ways, and we should have a way. It's in the best interest of our society to fund that. It's also in the best interest of our society if you're going to is to pay people fairly, which is then gets to the other side of this, is that you go, you spend a lot of money to get a degree, and then you find out people are like, yeah, man, you need to have a degree that may have cost you anywhere at the market price when you bought it. Now, I'm gonna go by 90s numbers. When I graduated, what was it? I think it was 7,000 for Pitt in state by the time I graduated. Maybe.
Something like that. Yeah.
Let's just say it was. Let's just say it was 7,000. I paid the out of state rate early, and then the back end I paid the in state rate. So let's just say 4 years. Let's say that the before interest and other stuff, that bill was 60,000. We'll just do that for conversation's sake. That then when I get the $60,000 investment in myself, and then you tell me, yeah, we got this job for you. Need a degree. We're gonna start at 27,000. Even in early 2000 in Pittsburgh numbers, 27,000 was probably okay. Like, I mean, as a single individual, you could make it work, right? We both live
right,
there,
right. Depending on where you're willing to live or have a roommate. I mean, I to your point, I just think it's a misalignment.
Yeah,
like we had an alignment for a long time, and the things got misaligned, and we never went back around to check the alignment. Mm-hmm. And so now you have a system that's so misaligned that you have to continue to go to school to make what you would have made with a master's degree with a PhD. You have to get a PhD to make what you would have made with a master's 20, 25 years ago. Mm-hmm. And only a certain amount of people can get into schools that almost guarantee you a job. Right? There's a certain amount of schools, like you said, certain private schools in America or schools that from land grants. Those places may promise you through connections, networks, and whatever have you. Mm-hmm. But you're paying so much for it. And so when the misalignment comes about, then you get to me, what we get to in America with this idea of fairness and who gets what and why. And how loans can be seen by some people as like, hey, you know what you were taking versus a tax cut. Now, I've said it before, the Trump tax cut benefited me. I'm not going to front and sit here and act like I didn't have more money in my check, right? But people will take, oh, you worked for that, so therefore you deserve a tax cut, right? Mm-hmm. Versus, do you deserve to get money off of a thing that you're paying on? You know what I mean? So it cuts to this like really clear thing of fairness, which is why I think, in a unique way, the idea of liberal arts schools are still important, because it's still about thinking about society and how things are and how they're distributed, and then having, a public discourse about how things are distributed, and not taking for granted that everyone should agree with how you think about how things are distributed, but really having a public conversation to be able to be persuasive for people to understand a way that things should occur. And I think that's like the importance of your ideas being in the public square. Mm-hmm. And debating them versus accepting a status quo, which I think the tide today between Defund the Police and student loans, the through line is clearly the assumption of the status quo. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Versus, is there a new conversation?
Yeah, that could be.
And what brings about what makes the new conversation the conversation to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the only other thought I really had on it was, I mean, I think it's a great, it's in the absence of the of other options, it's not a terrible deal necessarily. I think I would personally also I would say hope that the process that's been in place around the temporary relief due to public service, that would maybe continue like in tandem with this, right? So folks that maybe be doing, education work, other public entities serving roles would have the access to the opportunity to get some of their debt forgiven, and that this not be the end of the conversation, right? Like I think that there are, I could, Rajee throwing half-baked ideas up against the wall, could motion that there are several ways that we could think about, like how could you start to cut into what people are experiencing in terms of their debt load related to student loans, so that they could get up from under that. You know what I mean? I've heard the various different horror stories and folks doing the what's the name payment levels, and where you're paying this minimum payment, but due to that, the actual debt is continuing to get bigger and bigger. So the way compounded interest works, suddenly you have a $300,000 bill that's pretty much based on interest on the interest, which, seems unfair. I don't know. Maybe I'm being wild. Like I think the idea would be more optimal to have something like that be we spread out. There's some kind of cap to how much interest can go on, something, quite frankly, that it's not like you're going to be able to resell it. You know what I mean? It's not like a car. Like you're right. It's not like you could save that car you bought on a really crazy loan and had to get a refinance because of this, but you could make it like a classic car. If you hold it long enough, it'll be like, hey, they don't even make those no more. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like there's got to be a better answer. It's just debt.
Yeah, it's not a actual tangible product.
Yeah. So I think that my hope would be that further work in this area would start moving to, quite frankly, I'm sure someone better in finance and other things could tell us that there's got to be some gigantic lies on people's balance sheet about what they really are valued at. When you're like, oh, you're talking about that? That's what you're citing as collateral for this or this other move you're making? Seems a bit fishy. Maybe we should do something a little more substantial. Like maybe we shouldn't base our economic decisions on these sorts of things. But so I'm also, if anyone that's super dissatisfied with it, I'm cool with that too. This is not a justice telling you not to feel how you feel. I'm just making some space so that we can hopefully keep working on it. So hey, that's all I had.
Yes, sir. Well, for everyone today, you haven't received the full force and brunt of his intellectual capacity, but you've gotten a show.
Thank you. You know what I'm saying? I'm just trying to do my part to keep the conversation. You know what I'm saying? We say we got to start the conversation in America around all our inequities and unfair things. So I'm just trying to start the conversation.
Yes, sir.
All right. So with that, appreciate you. And I'll say, unless anything else for good order, I'll say peace.
Peace.
Thank you for listening to Good Brothers. Thank you to my good brother, Majestic. The Ask Your Oldhead podcast is a creative production brought to you by me, Justice Rajee, and Good Brothers is a part of that. You can support the podcast by listening, sharing wherever you listen, rating and subscribing wherever you listen. You can also search up Justice Rajee on Patreon and become a patron. You can also head to Etsy and search up Ask Your Oldhead and buy a t-shirt or a mug or a hoodie and put something towards the cause. Every dollar counts. Please take the best part for yourself, and we'll see you again soon. Peace.